welcome to the In My Beach Boys Room podcast. I am Adam Schreiner. I am your casual Beach Boys fan here with Matthew Hartz, Beach Boys expert, enthusiast, and nut, really. He's our Beach Boys house nut. Beach Boys nut. This is his rooms, basement, whatever you want to.
Sanctuary.
There
Rehabilitation facility.
There you go. All right, before we get into the real meat and the potatoes of this here podcast, we got to do our social media drops. So if you want to follow the podcast or Matthew Hartz, you can go to Instagram, and that's just Matthew Hartz Music, or Twitter at Matthew_Hartz. That's at Matthew_Hartz. I think we have some abandoned Matt Hartz Twitter accounts out there that look similar, but we can't get to those.
And it's Hartz, right?
Yeah, it's your logo.
Oh, it is? Okay, well then,
sometimes emails get lost these days, you know?
Yeah, okay. Sorry, guys.
Just Matthew_Hartz for Twitter. And then we got our Patreon page going. If you want to support the podcast, just go on over to Patreon. You can either search in the little search bar, Matthew Hartz, or In My Beach Boys Room. Either one will get you there. And then you can start supporting the podcast. And we really appreciate you, first of all, listening, and then let alone if you make it all the way to the Patreon page. So one other thing is we've been actually working on MatthewHartzMusic.com, and it's up right now, and we have some video lessons that, Matthew, not only is he a world champion fiddle player, violin player, but you play guitar, a bunch of string instruments, guitar, you play the mandolin?
And bass and other associated instruments with that, a little bit of banjo, different types of banjos and different types of guitars, right? And a little bit of keyboard, but basically the website is going to be devoted to building a musician the way I really think after all these years, really getting somebody started organically. It's really fun. We're right now we're working primarily on violin and guitar videos, and then some keyboard stuff with some theory modules we're working on. But it's just going to grow and grow and grow, and we're going to have supplemental material on there. We're going to have a lot of standard notation for some stuff, and not some standard notation or tab for some stuff, because some of the stuff
that's part of the process,
yes,
right?
Exactly. So,
and that's not ready yet, but it will be. And so you can, if you are interested, drop your email in the little email box, and as soon as we launch that teaching aspect of it, you'll get an email, and that'll let you know, and then you can hop right on. But we're working really hard on getting that done for you quickly here. So let's get back to the podcast, but let's talk about the podcast in general first. When Matthew and I were kind of brainstorming this podcast, we thought about maybe going in chronological order, or just kind of be a little more free with that. And we did decide to be a little more free because the Beach Boys, they're so vast, and there's a chronological order obviously with their career, but there's just so many other aspects of it. So this podcast is not going to necessarily follow chronological order. I mean, it might in certain areas, but we're going to bounce around. That's kind of more our style. We want to have a little more, fun, have that freedom.
Well, I think we decided that, we were going to get into this condensed history and kind of do it pretty linearly. And I think that in itself would get a little bit tedious, and we might as well just, sprinkle in and move around and just tell people where we're at.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Be more fun.
And specifically, like this episode specifically, this is something that I brought up to Matthew that I really wanted to know about, and that's Brian's songwriting. I want to know what makes it so great. Was he just born with it? Did he learn it? What's the big deal with Brian Wilson's music and his songwriting and everything? And so let's get into that. So educate me here, Matthew. Tell me what's going on with Brian's songwriting, his music, just everything. Why is he so well known for being such a great composer, songwriter, fill in the blank, whatever makes you an amazing musician?
Wow, what a long story.
Yeah.
What a story.
What a question, right? Like where to begin, really?
No, I know where to begin.
Oh, okay, perfect.
That's easy, and you kind of have to rewind, and we have to get off Brian for a second, because one thing I think is missed in this whole story is what great musicians that his parents, Murray and Audrey, both.
They were great musicians?
Oh, yes, they were really good musicians, and were such an influence on Brian's early life, and both his parents working with him musically. They famously got him accordion lessons at a very early age, but that didn't last very long. I really believe his early education came a lot from his folks. Audrey, her piano playing especially, but Murray, a lot of people know that he had some modest success as a songwriter in the 50s. And he famously had a tune that was performed by Lawrence Welk at the time on his show that was a hugely popular thing back then. The song was called Two Step Sidestep.
And that was Murray's song?
That's Murray's song. And I need to look up the exacts on dates for when that was. But anyway, I always knew about that tune, and I always knew that Lawrence Welk had done that thing with it, right? And it was a claim to fame of Murray's. Well, I'll tell you what, a man named James Murphy put out a book about maybe 7 years ago called Becoming the Beach Boys. It's 500 plus pages about just the first 2 years of the career, but also the childhood leading up to it, and where I found some new information for sure about this. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. Every Beach Boy fan needs to get it, even if they can't read through it. It answers a lot of questions. But in that book, it tells a more complete story of Murray's stuff in the 50s. And specifically, that song was recorded by, I think, 3, maybe 4 different artists. One of them, I was really surprised to find out, was a man named Johnny Lee Wills, who is, I think, the brother of a man named Bob Wills, who started a music called Western Swing in Texas, who is, because of my folk music stuff, I'm a huge Bob Wills fan, and I had no idea that I think it's his brother, might be a son or a nephew, but I think it's a brother, recorded a Murray Wilson song. It was just mind-blowing when I found that out a couple of years ago. But getting back to Murray and Audrey, we're talking about Murray right now, is he had more success than people think that he did. And he also had made a lot more connections within the industry than people really knew that he had done a lot of work. He's a hard-working, hard-driven man. And besides that, he had musical talent. I mean, some of the compositions that I've heard of Murray's at that time, and then even after that, there's some really nice stuff in those things. And so there's Murray, right? Mm-hmm. And there's the whole other story about Murray we'll get into, but that's the side of his musicianship. He was a guy that had talent and was already working within the music industry in Los Angeles. Uh-huh. Mom, Audrey, was a wonderful singer and was always singing with the boys early on. The earliest tapes, I hear her voice harmonizing with them. Brian famously talks about singing with Mom and make Carl sing with us right now. Carl has to sing with us before he can go out and play, sort of deal, because he was only like 8. But Audrey taught all those boys at least, I think, a lion's share of what they did on the piano early on. But then she was singing with them, harmonizing with them as Brian was learning, and we'll get into this in a little bit, the Four Freshmen arrangements. She was one of the people that he was teaching the parts to, so he could get all 4 parts in there and hear them all, sung together.
Okay, so the Four Freshmen... What
now?
We're gonna you will get into that.
We are going to get into that, and just after we get done talking about Murray and Audrey, because I think they're just as significant as
because I'm literally anything. When I'm really ignorant to this, so I'm just trying to follow the timeline here. So the Four Freshmen is something that Brian ends up doing.
That is a group that he got into as pretty early. I'm thinking that he first heard the first records when he was maybe around 10 years old or something. I might be wrong on that, but as a teenager, we'll get into that's what he really studied.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, and so I think a big part of Brian's songwriting comes from his parents, because they were very talented, and they were talented beyond what most people know about them.
Right, they're a musical family.
Audrey was a really humble lady, and I love some of the interviews where she says, "Oh, I sometimes get in touch with the fact that I am the mom of the Beach Boys," you know, you know, and never talking about herself. You know, it's kind of she was a polar opposite personality-wise from Murray, as far as, you know, she was definitely the soft side,
right,
and that soft, sweet side that all the boys carried some of that to some extent, for sure. But anyway, that's, you know, he started out with some great genetics, I think,
and then growing up in that,
and then also, you know, Murray was provided for them if they, you know, needed the instruments. He made sure that, you know, they had what they needed to do. And when Carl started taking up the guitar at, you know, at 11, 12 or something like that, you know, got him a guitar and got him lessons, you know, and, you know, the whole thing was, you know, he was facilitating an environment for it to happen. Right? So we can start to talk about the Four Freshmen if you want to.
Yeah. What's going on there?
Well, the Four Freshmen was a jazz harmony group from mainly the 50s. And it was really what we call them, it was very close jazz harmony. They sung in a very close, almost barbershop quartet style. If you look at it on a music staff, instead of the notes being spread apart, the chord is tightly clustered, and so it really has it provides for a lot of sophistication in listening to it, and also crafting music that way, right? It's so anyway, it's four voices going on, and Brian early resonated with the records, famously asked Audrey if he could buy one when they were at a store, and he went into the listening booth and said, well, we got to buy this. Can we get it, please? And he started buying the records. Well, subsequently, he'd come home from school every day, and it reminds me of my fiddle years, because I would come home as a teenager every day and just do nothing but music. But he would put on Four Freshmen records, and from what I understand, he basically learned their entire catalog.
Oh, wow.
From all the voices, and he learned it by setting a record needle down.
Do you happen to know like how big that catalog is?
Oh, it's significant. It is. And I don't know if I really need to. I don't know if Brian would say that or not, but I know it's significant. It's not just all the hits. You know what I mean? That sort of a deal. It's a deep study. It's a deep dive. And the way that he had to go about that, and then he's talked about this before, is he's a record player. Set the needle down, listen to the first couple of chords sung, because you got four voices singing chords in harmony, right? Mm-hmm. He'd pick it up after the first two chords, set it down, and figure it out on the piano exactly the way that and in what order they were configuring the voices, studying how those chords were being built. And these are sophisticated jazz chords. I mean, he's not thinking that in his mind. He's just learning how it's built organically by looking at it on his keyboard. And going through an entire body of work like that, with that much focus and that much intent, is almost an unrivaled musical education for the mind that endeavors in something like that. I mean, we need to rewind just a little bit too, because very early on, Brian was inspired very heavily at an early age by a piece called Rhapsody in Blue. It's a Gershwin piece, a famous piece from the 20s, and that's been, so there's elements in Brian's songwriting all the time, especially in the Smile period, of Rhapsody in Blue, you know, fragments coming through that. But there's always, I mean, when the Beach Boys get going, I mean, it's this wonderful smashing together of this jazz vocal group world with these dense, interesting chords against Chuck Berry.
Yeah.
and the excitement of early rock and roll and the true king of rock and roll, Chuck Berry, and what he did, and for the guitar, what we all still do today in rock and roll is and so, you know, it's been said many times that in a nutshell is it. It's taken Four Freshmen, putting it against Chuck Berry, especially in the beginning, but in a sense, kind of all the way through, you know, in different ways. So
those what you'd say. So those were kind of the main influences. Is that kind of what you're saying about?
No, that's how he learned to be a songwriter. It's how he learned about music theory.
So it's separate from an influence, then that wouldn't be necessarily.
No, that would be definitely an influence,
but also the musical education aspect of it.
Both to the
so then any other
nth degree.
Any other musical influences then that
he had?
That you can kind of see.
Oh yeah,
you know, through
all
his
those
music.
All the 50s doo-wop groups. He's famously a musical omnivore, but he likes you know, crooners like Rosemary Clooney and you know old swing and jazz singers. He has an affinity for. You know, he was a Hoagie Carmichael fan, who's a famous jazz composer. You know, Gershwin, of course, but he says the song "Rock Around the Clock." Are you familiar with that,
yeah.
Bill Haley?
Oh yeah.
You know, I think that came out in 55 or 56, but he talks about that just blew his head off when it came out. You know, he just loved. If it was good music, he was loving it. The Four Freshmen thing can't be overstated enough, and I'm trying to think that for a casual fan, how we can make that simpler to look at. But that was basically his education. I know that David Crosby in the Don Was documentary, I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, which was done in 95 or something like that, he was sitting there talking with Graham Nash. They're sitting in New York someplace, and Graham Nash, I think, says, how do you write like that? How do you arrange like that? And David says, well, you live at the piano figuring out Four Freshmen, with that being your main deal in life, and that's how he, and I really can't really agree more.
Yeah, just because of the nature of the Four Freshmen.
It's
music.
so complex,
yeah.
and if you deconstruct all of that and put it all back together using your own family, because you don't, you know, one of the things that they got Brian early on was a tape recorder so he could record his voice and sing back with, you know, that was magical stuff in those days.
Right.
Not like today, man, where we have all this stuff that facilitates all the fun things we want to do recording wise, right?
Back then, not the case at
all.
all.
Man, you know, and even early on, you know, he was to the point of it was so analog, we got to get human beings to do it, you know. So mom, Carl, even though you're 8, and dad, or sometimes Dennis at that early point. The other thing so we've talked about it a little bit, but Brian's songwriting style and the tricks that he used, they embraced new and old things. The new being in the, like early on, the Chuck Berry stuff, and of course the subject matter. But musically, the things that he did, they're the types of tricks that you learn when you study old traditional jazz, or even the pop tunes of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, what they call, you know, some of the Tin Pan Alley stuff. And also the tricks that were used in those Four Freshmen records as far as key modulation.
Okay, yeah, I was just about to ask, what do you mean by tricks? So
yeah, key modulating, you know, and not just in obvious spots, but where the magic to me as a musician, a lot of it in Brian's music, I found out, is because he changes keys sometimes in the middle of part, you know, they're not really necessarily analyzed as key changes, but that's what they really are. And a key change really feels like a real shift emotionally, you know. It fits. So I really, that stuff is through all the catalog, even the early catalog, in different ways, you know. But then it's really, you know, get to Pet Sounds, and it's really happening in a huge way, affecting a lot of those tunes in a huge way. But so that and then basically just those old jazz tricks, you know. This is where we should have a big star in the episode is where I really feel like the reason Brian is so impactful to the pop and rock and roll world, music world in America, is he really was the first guy to bring jazz into rock and roll, and he integrated it in an amazing way, and he didn't even really know he was doing it. You ask him about jazz, go, I don't play jazz. I don't, well, he studied jazz harmony for years as a teenager and was in love with it, even if he might not have called it studying jazz harmony at that point, right? He just loved the Four Freshmen. He loved the sounds of their voices and what they were doing. I don't think when he was young, he didn't even think about the complexity of the chord so much as maybe how it made him feel.
Sure.
Same way his music did with me as a very young person.
Yeah. Just hits you. It just hit him differently, and just like it hit you differently. Or it's not. Yeah, it's not just like another song that you heard. It had a different. It evoked a different response.
Right, and I think, compared to a lot of the other music I was listening at the time, and when I was born in 1969, so this would have been the early 70s when I'm listening to my mom's old records, which are only like not even 10 years old at that time. I'm thinking this is so weird. The fact that the other music I was listening to, some of it was really amazing too. Like, for instance, Paul Simon. I mean, just a huge nut. My dad and I got to go up and see Paul and Brian on tour together up at the Gorge.
Oh, nice.
In
great
Washington.
Venue, great artist. Yeah, that sounds like a good time.
It was an amazing show. It was really, really good. But I knew that, especially as I was listening to a lot of the other pop records my folks had, the folk stuff too, that there was just something so sophisticated going on in Brian's music, something so different, something so special that I didn't know what it was. I just knew it was. I knew it was. That introduction to California Girls is still just going to be, it's the big bang moment of my life.
Right.
Is what that is just listening to that progression of chords and what all those different instruments do to those chords as we just progress through that opening of that tune is just like just one of the most masterful paintings I've ever seen. It's just so brilliant. And I don't know if that helps other people appreciate it or not, but
well, maybe they'll listen to it, with a different perspective than they have in the past.
Brian, when I remember when Pet Sounds was re-released on CD in the early 90s, and one of the things that they asked him is, do you have any suggestions for anybody listening to the album? He goes, yeah, listen to it on headphones in the dark.
Yeah.
The other thing we wanted, other early influences, I want to go back to Chuck Berry because it was a huge influence on Carl and his guitar playing early on. But Chuck Berry's tunes resonated with Brian and Mike both early on too, way before they were in the late 50s when they were happening. It was a big influence on Brian, and lots of other people from that era. But the doo-wop stuff that they ended up emulating on some of their early records, Brian was into all that, and Mike was especially into that. And they've got a lot of early records where you can definitely hear that influence heavy duty.
Sure.
The difficult keys. I also, when I started playing guitar pretty heavy, like about 6, 7, 8 years old, right in there. I remember trying to, I would put on records and play along with them. And when I put on the Kingston Trio, I had a pretty easy time of it, and even I put on a Neil Diamond record, I was able to play some of those tunes pretty, but I put on side 2 of Summer Days and tried to play California. I just knew it's like, I can't even figure this out. I need help, or I remember early on my dad and mom getting me a songbook. It had the cover of 15 Big Ones on it, but it wasn't the songs of 15 Big Ones. It was just kind of like a greatest hits thing. And it looked like it was all the official published music. It said Irving and Guild music and stuff on the bottom of it. But all of the tunes were in the wrong keys. I knew they weren't on the same keys that on the record, but I remember, especially California Girls, I got like into it 2 measures after the introduction, and I remember being so upset, and I told Dad, this thing isn't even close to right. This isn't going to teach me how to really play California Girls, because it doesn't, it's hard to explain that.
I mean, just knowing that it's not the same.
For most, it might have worked for a lot of people.
Yeah, but not for you. You weren't having
it. And musically, in a later deal, we're going to talk about what happens in the second chord change in the bridge of California Girls. That right there, it's California Girls, Wouldn't It Be Nice, and Good Vibrations all in one chord change, and it had happened previous to that too. But it's a moment that could be analyzed from a musical perspective that really is going, wow, yeah, I didn't know that point of the verse of California Girls was that
complex or
pivotal, like it can be interpreted so many ways that whoever wrote that book, I see where they got the idea that they came up for that chord change. Or, I don't want to get into it deep right now, but it was wrong.
Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't the actual. What was actually going on?
No. Even when we're talking about the key changes being one of the tricks, and so modulating to a difficult key, or even writing whole songs in difficult keys.
So when you say modulate, does that just mean change?
Change keys. Yeah. So you change the system with which you're working. It's the same system. You just move it
into a different key.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, even the earliest tune, which it wasn't the earliest recorded officially, but it's Surfer Girl is considered to be Brian's first tune that he wrote, and I believe on the earliest versions of it, even there's a half step modulation in the end of it from the original key of D to E flat.
Okay,
that for a 14-year-old kid playing the guitar and a bass player, and guys that are just kind of from somebody who's been teaching guitar for a while, that even that little move is a big one.
Yeah, impressive, right? And for someone at that age.
Yeah, but writing a tune with that kind of sophistication right out of the gate.
Yeah,
and that's not just the modulation in Surfer Girl is not the only thing of note. In it, the way he alters the doo-wop progression in the body of the tune is really part of the beauty of it and why it's lasted so long. We talk about the songwriting, and I guess it's almost like we're kind of in the early part of his songwriting, but if you just take a listen from the albums from 1962 to 65, the studio albums, let's say Surfin' Safari, Surfin' USA, Surfer Girl, Little Deuce Coupe, Shutdown Volume 2, All Summer Long, Side 1 of the Christmas album, and not the concert album because that's all stuff, but then Today and Summer Days from 65. That's a 3-year span. Listen to that first album, Surfin' Safari, front to back, and then listen to the Beach Boys Today through Summer Days, front to back. And you try to tell me that there isn't something just absolutely insane going on as far as a level of growth and maturity.
Yeah. Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Everything is just like, the manic expression and the rate at which he created, not just for the Beach Boys, but other people during that time, all kinds of people, Jan and Dean, his wife and sisters, the Honeys, just to name a couple of very many people he worked with outside of the Beach Boys, even during this period. So the story of him, that was his time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that is a lot of music to put out in a 3-year span.
Yeah, and you listen to the difference between Surfin' Safari And
so he's at Servant Safari. How old is he there?
oh, he's, let's see, 62, so he's right at 20.
20.
Yeah.
3 years later, and just
Yeah.
a ton of growth in that time. Yeah, I mean, I need to do that apparently.
Yeah, but I'm sure that we'll get into other aspects of the songwriting. The original question being, what there's
sticking on Brian's songwriting specifically, and if you have, like you said, kind of have been focused on the earlier stuff, but I mean, he continued to write and write and write.
Oh yeah, and went through different phases in his songwriting where he different songwriting styles. As a matter of fact, that brings to mind this is the most brilliant book written on Brian's songwriting, Philip Lambert's book, and this is not the only book that he's a music theory
and it's Inside
professor.
the Music of Brian Wilson is the title.
Yes.
The songs, sounds, and influences of the Beach Boys' founding genius.
Yes, and it's, if you're a musician, this is especially because there's a lot of details about musician knowledge and stuff like that only going to interest you if you know things about that.
Sure, yeah.
And so
that book would probably not interest me all that much.
I love the style. Okay. I think that there would be parts of it. It's not all that type of analysis, but it's just a great book.
Yeah, maybe not. Actually, I see that it's it is kind of you could fast forward past the stuff that you don't understand if you really wanted to know.
Yep. It's just, that's one thing I want people to seek out if they really want to understand some of the deep stuff.
Deep, the depths of his songwriting, right?
Right. And the last thing I want to say in this episode about his songwriting is Carl, in one of the last documentaries that was done, obviously before he passed away, he talks about he and Brian, sometime probably in the late 80s or something like that, they were on a Beach Boys retreat or something where they actually had to room together for a while, because believe it or not, in Beach Boy world, even when you're brothers, you don't spend that much time around each other,
right?
In the later years and stuff. So anyway, I think they were sharing a room or something like that. And I think Carl asked Brian, why do you think the music succeeded on a level that it did, or why did we, or anything? And Brian's answer is, I think that it was a pure, just a real simple expression of joy that was real direct. And so the resonance didn't really depend on you being a musician or not, I think, is one of the points of that.
Yeah, I mean, as you and I sit here and talk, I mean, that's kind of proof right there, of
right,
that.
Right. And I think that no matter how much I wax poetically about how genius everything he did was, we have to realize that it resonated with a lot larger audience than just a musically educated audience.
Yeah,
and so
I think I think that point alone is profound. That there is, not necessarily a musician's ear listening, but still loving it, and then a musician's ear can listen and also just love it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the earliest examples, "Catch a Wave" from the Surfer Girl album. It's one of their it wasn't a hit. It wasn't even released as a single or anything like that, but it's an album on the album, and it's always been a real crowd pleaser. But to me, the chord changes, there's some of the beginnings of punk rock in there, and nobody would, there's just some really interesting things in even the early music that's going on that the listener has no idea of the complexity of it. As a matter of fact, it's pretty surface, it's bubblegum pop.
Right.
But is that the genius of it, that he wove into it all this musical complexity even from the beginning and made it sound simple? So he made it accessible.
Yeah, that is pretty awesome for sure, to be able, the accessibility of it, and not just from musician a musician's ear to a non-musician's ear, but from, generational as well. I mean, like you said, if it's this 60th year anniversary, you can count on a couple fingers how many bands can have that.
Yeah, but all through their career, they're just rediscovered by a younger audience, and we've talked about how a lot of music from the the Beatles and the Stones and the Beach Boys and all of we can't mention everybody here, but I mean a lot of that stuff is taken out of time because it's so good that everybody resonates with it no matter what.
No matter what, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's pretty sweet. That's pretty cool. So then that's pretty much it then for this episode. If you enjoyed this, please give us a 5-star rating. If you didn't, you can just not listen, and you don't have to give us any bad ratings. So that stuff really is important in these first episodes to get some traction. So if you enjoyed this, please do review, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, remember, the smile you send out returns to you.